Hello and welcome to the Batesville Church of Christ. Today we are continuing our study of Hebrews. We will begin with chapter 9. This is referred to as kind of the middle section of the book, even though there are 13 chapters. Some are shorter, some are longer, but the middle section is how this is referred to. We mentioned last week that chapter 8 verse 1 starts a section that runs through chapter 10:18, I think it is. So this is one thought that carries through. This section focuses on the high priestly ministry of Christ. As we've stated earlier, we talked about Christ being better than or superior to the angels, better than Moses, superior to Moses, better than the Levitical priesthood. This section talks about how much better his actual ministry is because, first off, it's in heaven, in the presence of God, where sin can be dealt with pretty straight ahead. So this section talks about the temporariness, if that's a word, of the old priesthood, of the tabernacle, which implicates the temple as well, earthly sanctuaries. The tabernacle existed while the people were traveling into the promised land. Then David wanted to build a temple, which Solomon actually ended up building, which was an absolute magnificent temple covered in gold, in and out, cedars of Lebanon, all the finest articles of construction that were available at the time. That temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 596 BC. There was no temple in Jerusalem for a while. When Zerubbabel, along with Nehemiah, Ezra, prophets Haggai and Zechariah, when they came back out of the Persian captivity, 444, somewhere around in there, they started building a new temple, which was in place in Jerusalem at that time. Through the Greeks and different people, the temple had some damage and stuff to it. The temple that's in place at this point, referred to as Herod's temple. So all of these priestly activities are still going on for the Jews in this temple in Jerusalem. So this next section, we are comparing this worship with the new, better covenant, the new, better testimony of Christ. So we see that chapter 8 was an introduction into this study. In terms of content, chapter 9, verse 1 through chapter 10:18, that all belongs together. It should be read together. So if you're studying this at home along with this class study, read that section together, chapter 9 through chapter 10, verse 18. And if you got other translations, which can be found easily online, it always helps me to read a couple of good, valid translations just to get different ideas and different approaches to this information. As we said earlier, this focuses on the priestly ministry of Christ, and this is referred to as the middle section of Hebrews. And so we see in this priestly ministry, we'll see a lot of ceremonial terms. When I say ceremonial, I mean the priestly ministry, the kind of terms that go along with that sort of ministry. Terms like offer, priests offer, offering, priests are offering things, sacrifice is made, blood, no sacrifice can be made without the shedding of blood. That's been said over and over. And that blood is shed for what? For sins. Okay, so just to kind of consider the ceremonial vocabulary that the author uses, during this section, the word offer is used 12 times. Offering is used 5 times. Sacrifice is used 9 times. Covenant is used 10 times. Blood is used 11 times. Sin also is used 11 times. So we see this real concentration of this ceremonial vocabulary because that's what we're talking about here. The Levitical priests sacrifice and their offering for sin as opposed to Christ's sacrifice and offering for sin. It's a great set of terms used by the author here to look at the most magnificent event in history, and that is Christ sacrificing himself for us. In chapter 8, the author alluded to two sanctuaries. The tabernacle, or the temple, as we stated, and also the heavenly sanctuary where Christ ministers, and the fact that the one on earth was a mere shadow or a mere copy of the real one to come. Chapter 9 contrasts these two sanctuaries. So we see the author point blank coming to this Jewish audience and saying, okay, look at this old one that God did away with. God says it was weak, it was useless. Look at this new one and the sacrifice that was made and the hope that it gives us and the assurance of that hope. So this is basically what this section, middle section of Hebrews is about. The Jewish people of this time were very familiar with the tabernacle and its regulations for worship. Let's look at chapter 9, verse 1. Now, even the first covenant had regulations of divine worship and the earthly sanctuary. So, there were regulations. There were things that had to be done. Notice the fact that the word earthly is used here in verse 1 as opposed to a heavenly one. We will talk more about that here in a little bit. It was the heavenly one is not worldly. It is not of this world. It is a heavenly sanctuary not made with hands. Okay? The earthly tabernacle consisted of two distinct sections. Now, the author here talks about these two sections a good bit here in the first part of chapter 9. We will go through what he says. If you really want to study the tabernacle and its construction, I think Exodus 30 is probably a good starting place. Go to Leviticus 13 and you'll see all of these rules and regulations of divine worship that are referred to here in verse 1. But we're about to discuss these regulations. We've noticed in the past how each section is set off by word studies here, okay? Look at verse 10, which is the end of this section, chapter 9, verse 1 through 10. Since they relate only to food and drink, various washings, regulations for a body imposed until a time. Verse 1, note the first covenant had its regulations. So this section here is set off by these two words, speaking of all of the different regulations. Okay, verse 2. For there was a tabernacle prepared, the outer one, in which were the lampstand and the table and the sacred bread. This is called the holy place. All right, that's where your regular or ordinary, I'm sure they didn't like that term, priests were able to go. They could go into the holy place. Verse 3 says, behind the second veil there was a tabernacle which is called the Holy of Holies. Okay, this is where the high priest only could go. And he could only go there once a year. We'll talk more about this, but basically on the Day of Atonement. He had to sacrifice for himself before he could even go in to the Holy of Holies. Let's continue. Verse 3, I'll start back there. And behind the second veil there was a tabernacle which is called the Holy of Holies, having a golden altar of incense, the Ark of the Covenant, covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden jar holding the manna, the sustenance of the people, and Aaron's rod which budded, and the tables of the covenant, or of the law. All right, we see these are the items that were in the holy, in the Holy of Holies. Okay, So we see verse 5, above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. But of these things we're not going to speak now in detail. As I said earlier, if you want to look at all of that, Exodus 30 is the place to go for a description of everything that was in the tabernacle. It may be interesting to know that later in the temple, the only thing that was in the Ark of the Covenant were the tables of stone that Moses brought down. Now you can see that in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 9. During Saul's reign, the ark was taken into possession by the Philistines. It was grief and aggravation to them because they weren't supposed to have it. It went from place to place. They finally decided just to get rid of it. I can only assume at this point in time is when these items were removed, or prior to, I don't know. There's no documentation of that. We just know that by 1 Kings 8, verse 9, the only thing in there are the tables of stone. Okay, let's continue with verse 6. Now, when these things had been thus prepared, the priests are continually entering the outer tabernacle, performing the divine worship. But into the second, only the high priest enters, once a year, not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the sins of the people committed in ignorance. Okay, they were set up this way. We see that the high priest is going in once a year, but not without blood. No sacrifice can be made without blood. That's a valid point, and these Jewish readers understand that completely. The high priest had to sacrifice for himself before he could go in. All right, this is how things were set up. Let's just look at it a little bit here. In the holy place was in the outer tent. The Holy of Holies was in the inner tent. In the holy place, priests could go, but in the Holy of Holies, high priest only could go. In the outer tent, these priests were offering continually, daily sacrifices, all the time, sacrificing. In the Holy of Holies, only once a year did the high priest go in. Okay, the outer tent, the priests were trimming lamps, lighting incense, dealing with physical things, just relating to rituals, okay? The Holy of Holies, the priest went in not without blood. He had to take blood with him, sprinkle it all over everything, purify himself before he went in so he could make an offering for the people. All right, so let's look at a couple of points in this description here. First off, continually is the author's word for the daily function of the ordinary priest, meaning that it literally went on continually. They were constantly doing this. Second of all, once is a significant term here and usually refers to Christ's once sacrifice. But in this case, it's used to designate once a year, okay, for the priest. This was once a year, not once for all, for one time, like Christ's offering of himself. All right, third, not without blood lays stress on the inaccessibility of the Holy of Holies. The high priest wouldn't go in there, dare go in there, not even once a year, without blood of bulls and goats. There were many, many more precautions and regulations and stuff that we've referred back to Leviticus chapter 13 if you want to study more about that. Fourthly, the term of errors of ignorance here at the end of verse 7, which he offered for himself and for the sins of the people committed in ignorance. Now, we see in Numbers 15, verses 27 and 28, that these are the only sins, really, that the high priest could make offering for, that the people could be forgiven of. All this other stuff was pushed forward. But sins of ignorance, sins that you didn't mean to commit, things that happened that you really did not set in your heart that I'm going to sin. I've decided I'm going to do this. Something that comes up by ignorance, or by lack of knowledge, by mistake, an accident, apparently Numbers 15, 27, 28, those sins were forgiven. So you might want to check into that just to do a little background study on that. So if those types of sins were able to be forgiven, obviously something other than Moses' law had to be put into place to actually forgive all sins. And what was that? Yeah, that was the offering of Christ. Okay? So in all of these rites, the author sees God's hand. He sees the Holy Spirit provided for its law and its ordinances of worship. Verse 8, the Holy Spirit is signifying this, that the way into the holy place has not yet been closed while the outer tabernacle is still standing. So what does that mean? That means that this was a temporary thing. That the way into the holy place has not been disclosed while the outer tabernacle is still standing. As long as this tabernacle is in place, as long as this temple is in place, we can't go into the presence of God. We cannot go forward. It was, the way into the sanctuary was not yet open. What divided the sanctuary? Well, it was a veil, did not. We said that it was a veil that separated the holy from the Holy of Holies. So it shut the people out. It shut God in. It separated the people from God. There's no way to get into the presence of God as long as the veil of the tabernacle or the veil in the temple was in place. Take away the veil, immediately you've got access to God. Your worship to God is in His presence. By the way, that's the veil that was torn in two when Christ died on the cross. You might want to check that out. Pretty symbolic there, do you think? Okay, let's move on to verse 9. This outer tabernacle is still standing in verse 8, which is a symbol for the present time. Okay, that was a symbol for the present time, for the law of Moses. It was going on then. Accordingly, both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make the worshiper perfect in conscience. Couldn't do it. The blood of bulls and goats, the ashes of heifers, all of that could not remove the sins of the people. It didn't matter how big this pile of dead animals was. It was not going to bring the people into the presence of God. The whole ancient system was at fault, and it only dealt with physical things. Look at verse 10. Since they relate only to food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until a time of reformation. What is this time of reformation? Well, it's the new covenant. It's the new, better law. It is a reformation. It's a doing away with the old one and the beginning of the new one. That's what makes this middle section here of Hebrews so fantastic. We're studying the old law versus the new law, and we're putting it down to the brass tacks right here. The old law is no good. Look at all this stuff that was happening, and it didn't do anything. But the new covenant, the new law. Okay, as we go into this next section of chapter 9, verses 11 through 14 are the real nitty-gritty, so to speak. It is the middle of the middle. It's been referred to as the heart of Hebrews. It's not only right in the middle of this section between chapter 8, verse 1 and chapter 10, verse 18, but it's literally in the middle of the book. It's the center. As to their structure, it's significant that the first word in Greek, as we read in our Bibles, but when Christ appeared. It's the first section in all of Hebrews that a new section starts with the name of Christ. It's the first word in Greek in all of Hebrews. It's the first time that a sentence as well as a new section begins. In chapter 8 and this far in chapter 9, there's been no direct reference to Christ. We've talked about this old law, the tabernacle, the temple, the Levitical priesthood, holy place, holy of holies, all this stuff. We didn't say anything about Christ. But now, as we begin talking about the eternal heavenly sacrifice, we start this section off with the name of Christ, the Messiah. All right, so we see in chapter 8 through verse 9, he's been waiting. We've talked about this, all of this other stuff, but now, boom, we are fixing to hit this next section. Okay, I suggest that you go ahead and read through chapter 10, verse 18. I'm going to stop this lesson maybe a little bit early this time because I want to continue through the end of chapter. Go ahead and finish out chapter 9. We'll start next week with 11 and go on through the end of the chapter and continue on into chapter 10, verse 18. Thanks for your attention. Read this section over and over, and you'll get a bunch of good information that it seems to me to be impossible to deny the fact that the New Testament has come into place with Christ as its high priest and minister in heaven with God, as opposed to an old earthly system that we washed and went on and on and on with these washings, washing this, washing the garments, washing the vessels, wash this, but it never actually made anything clean. Thank you for your attention this morning.